From Buffalo Toronto Public Media and WBFO, this is What's Next Producers Picks, highlights from a conversation heard on a previous episode. On today's show,
you don't have to identify with the white rage to be able to see that it exists. So like we're all living in this system that was created by this rage to keep Black people specifically out of key positions, to limit education, to limit our workforce participation.
We hear from Stephanie Peete, Wil Green, and Rob Leteste, who all appeared on a recent panel themed around Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. The event was moderated by Green, the Director of Outreach and Community Engagement at the University at Buffalo's Graduate School. Peete is Say Yes Buffalo's Workforce Development Director, and Leteste is the Business Intelligence and Workforce Manager at Invest Buffalo Niagara. Both appeared as panelists along with professionals in law, mental health, and other fields. We'll hear a bit from that discussion as well as some context around the larger conversations that led to it. I'm Patrick Hoskin. Thanks for listening. We start with Jay Moran sitting down with Peete, Green, and Leteste to preview the event. The four discuss how systemic inequality impacts education, professional development, and labor and workforce needs here in Buffalo.
Stephanie Peete with us. And Stephanie, we'll talk with you first and foremost as the Director of Workforce Development at Say Yes, and also the person who's organizing this panel discussion. Let's start with the title. The title of the panel discussion. It's got quite the name to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about the book White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. And the panel discussion is really focusing on the organized resistance to Black progress. And we're looking at it through the lens of workforce development and education.
And you also have opened this up to the public, of course. Whoever wants to attend, there's probably an opportunity. We can maybe talk about that later in the program. But the key part of it is what you're talking about, workforce development, is getting some of the main employers in Western New York in the room to talk about this. Connect the dots a little bit there, because I think in some ways, just the term white rage and the name of the book might stand out on its own, and it might be obviously, why you went about doing this, so connect the dots there a little bit for us.
Yeah, so I recommended this book on LinkedIn a few months ago, and people started reading it and requested a discussion, so we decided to plan it. We're focusing on this book because I think the term white rage, or the title white rage, elicits like this, we talked about before, this imagery of violence and something that you can visually see, but as Carol Anderson explores in this book, it's really about how those feelings were channeled into legislation and policy. So when we look at Buffalo and see the segregation, we know the economic inequity in our community, that is a remnant of the laws and the policies that were happening nationally and that were funneled locally. So what we want to do is bring employers together to, one, talk about the book, explore the local data, but also talk about, okay, so what can we do differently in our seats? We don't have to wait on anyone. We can come together as employers, as workforce trainers, as philanthropy, as business leaders. What can we do to come together and actually change what this looks like in our community for young people and their families and our general community?
Also with us, we were going to have the moderator of the event, Wil Green, who is from Tremonte Solutions, and also now the Assistant Dean at the University of Buffalo I'll let you give the whole title here, Wil. The whole title is, because it's brand new, right?
Yeah, brand new.
What's the title again? Your new title?
Assistant Dean for Outreach and Community Engagement at the Graduate School of Education.
Congratulations on the new position, for sure.
Thank you.
And also with us, we have Rob Leteste from Invest Buffalo Niagara with their Business Intelligence and Workforce Manager. Thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thank you for welcoming me.
All right, so let's expand the conversation here. Then first, let's go to Rob. Rob, from a workforce development perspective, how do you see this panel discussion working here in terms of what you think employers might get from this?
Well, a couple of years ago, we did a labor market assessment for the 8-county Buffalo Niagara region, incorporated feedback from 150 stakeholders. We brought in a global national consultant, Newmark, to lead the study for us because of their data capabilities, but also their intel with industry needs, as we're seeing a lot of growth in manufacturing and other emerging industries. And we wanted to see what our gaps were for being able to match our local talent with what these new opportunities are going to look like. After doing the study, they identified 20 occupations that they've identified as being key for our region's growth. When you take a look at the demographic profile of those occupations, only one is close to the regional demographic makeup of our region for our Black and African American population, and only a couple for our Hispanic population. So right now, the current paradigm is we do not have the representation within these key occupations that are going to determine whether or not our region can land opportunities, but then also our vitality moving forward.
Well, you said there was just one for the Black demographic. What was that?
Truck drivers.
Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting to know. So there's a lot of room for growth in this regard, and this is where we have to get everybody in the same room. Wil, you're going to have to moderate these different panelists here as well. Give me some of your thoughts about this, going in. It's still a couple of weeks off. There's some work to be done between now and then. But in terms of leading this group of people, and it's going to be we'll use the word diverse because it's going to be, I think, when it comes to employers, it sounds like we've got a lot of different types of employers from Western New York. What's your strategy moving forward here?
Really, it's just to bring the panelists together to look at some key points from the book. I love the way that the book is structured and looking at some key historical elements and key historical time frames, and really just get the panelists to open up about their personal feelings about those events, what's happening currently, and how it impacts what's happening in the workforce.
What are the possibilities of a panel discussion? Let's look at that, right? It sounds like you got an idea what you want to do and how to keep it moving, but what can we gain when it's a panel discussion? There's multiple people giving their thoughts and perspectives.
Well, I think because, number one, we're looking at workforce development, right? So we got someone from Hodge and Russ, right? So that's a lawyer. Mm-hmm. We have someone from National Fuel. Of course, we have Stephanie and Rob. So we've got these different elements of workforce development and workforce period. But I think what's interesting is how do we all narrow it down, I guess, and go backwards? Because that's what Carol Anderson is able to do. How do we go backwards and look at the things that have happened and how they continue to impact, workforce? What do we consider as professional? What does professional mean when you really start to think about it? I remember a few years ago, there was a CEO that came out like, hey, I'd love to hire more diverse staff, but they're just not qualified. What does it mean to be qualified? And hopefully the panel can speak to that, because it hasn't been my experience in the workforce in Buffalo that folks aren't qualified. It's that they're coming in with different cultural norms, different ways of interacting. And because of these long-standing traditional concepts of what it means to be a professional, they're being alienated, ostracized, and moved out the door.
Well, you've touched upon some really interesting stuff there, Wil. Let's switch back to Rob for just a second, though. When you, what you just heard Wil saying right there is a divide then between what employers want, what they think they want, maybe is even a better way of describing it, and what is really available in this market, or is there more development that's needed?
There's always going to be more development that's needed. I think what we're definitely emphasizing across the region is employer participation within the talent development pipeline. We're oftentimes focused on the entry-level roles, but as equal are the mid-level roles as well. And as you are expanding the talent sources and being more inclusive of groups that are currently underrepresented at your place of employment, you are building that bench larger for the potential next first-line supervisors and ideally future innovators in town. I think part of the benefit of the panel discussion when we bring in that industry diversity is you have industries like healthcare where there is a lot of representation, and they're able to then educate employers in spaces where maybe there's less, like manufacturing, on best practices they've seen. But even then, manufacturing is able to share some of the best practices they have on talent development overall, on things like apprenticeship and the like, that moves people up that pathway from being at that entry-level role to some of those more higher-level ones that honestly are the ones that we as a region need to be generating more of from that pipeline of existing workers, as opposed to just having people land in those roles fresh out of high school.
I want to step to Stephanie, because you're the reader of all of us here, of course. The book, White Rage, by Carol Anderson, New York Times bestseller. It's got a spectacular title for sure. Yet the title, in some regards, could be considered misleading because, as I mentioned, I think before we went on the air, when I think of White Rage, I'm thinking of somebody who's yelling at the cable news channel as they're watching the news at 10 o'clock at night, or whatever the case may be. But there's more subtlety to it than just that.
Absolutely. So I think what's really important, I wanted to have this panel discussion because I wanted people to understand that you don't have to identify with the white rage to be able to see that it exists. So, like, we're all living in this system that was created by this rage to keep Black people specifically out of key positions, to limit education, to limit our workforce participation. And if we're not, like Will said, like looking at what's right now and moving backwards to understand how we got here, how do we unravel it? How do we create something that works better for everyone unless we understand where it actually came from? So, I mean, the title is definitely provocative, but I think that's a good thing. And I think having this discussion will help folks who would never read this book on their own. You know what I mean? Like, this discussion, I think, is very accessible. We're going to have a conversation with a group of people who come from different walks of life, but really want to see Buffalo win. And it's not we can't win unless we talk about the inequities in our community and what we're going to do, because everyone has a responsibility. We're not looking to point fingers of who did what, who didn't do what. That doesn't matter anymore. We have some solutions that we think could work. Let's come together and all put our hands in and move things forward so our community is much more equitable.
Let's maybe let's broaden out and let everybody kind of chime in where they want to come in on this. We can talk about what's in White Rage and about some of the policy and or legislation that have been developed throughout the years that have kept people separated, that have kept people down, for sure. What do we see here in Western New York? Is there an understanding among employers that, they're kind of what you were talking about a little bit there earlier, Will, about the idea that the perception of what a professional is not really in tune with what an employer is needed, or an employer may need, or what an employer could utilize. So I guess what I'm asking here is there an understanding among employers that, we're maybe getting people who don't fit a certain mold, but yet have so much to offer? I mean, I want to see if we can kind of connect the dots, maybe make this more of a local discussion. Who wants to try to take that one in first?
I mean, I'll start. I think we have a lot of employers. So at SAYS, we have our Modern Youth Apprenticeship Framework, Career-Wise Greater Buffalo, that we launched in 2021. From what we're seeing, we have a lot of employers who they see, okay, yes, there's something that we could be doing differently. Like, we're not seeing the diversity that we want. It's a matter of capacity and understanding how to go about that. So I think the sweet spot with our team at SAYS, we're all from Buffalo Public Schools, all but maybe one or two of us on our entire team. We all live in a city, so we're very well equipped to kind of like bridge that gap between employers not really understanding how to connect with the kids graduating out of our district and our young people who want to work. They want to do well for themselves. They want to take care of their families. They want to be thriving young adults, but haven't really figured out how to navigate, that career pathway just yet. We're right there in the middle to provide support on both ends. And in our apprenticeship framework, we meet with our employer partners once a month. And it's not just us giving them best practices on how to work with our young people. They're also sharing what they're doing and what's working. So it's a really amazing space that we've created for employers to talk about doing things that are completely different than how they've been doing it in the years past. So you're talking about 18-year-olds who are getting hired for roles in like HR and like data analytics, with companies like M&T and Rich Products and, Delaware North and Wegmans. So it's an amazing opportunity for employers to say, okay, we want to do something different. We want we have talent needs, of course, everyone does, but we want to make sure that we're being a lot more inclusive. We want to tap into the talent that's local, and that's the way to do it.
You heard her comments. Who wants to maybe add on to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the one thing that keeps coming up in the back of my mind is how nuanced the conversation is, and there's so many cracks and crevices to the conversation. I mean, creating those spaces where people can come together and talk about those nuances and share failures and successes is vital. Because if we just talked about workforce development and organizational culture in itself is a massive topic to break down. And there are some organizations that have positive culture and they allow communication to flow from the bottom to the top. And there are some cultures that don't. When you mix in coming from a city that's segregated like Buffalo, right? How does segregation in communities impact changing the workforce or workplace diversity in an organization? You gotta have those conversations because you may have the want to and the desire to change it, but if you don't understand what it means to live in a community where there are very few people who look different from you, how will you deal with that in a workplace when emotions get involved? When policy gets involved, that is not quite where it should be for everyone if they look the same. So it's a super nuanced conversation, but it has to start with bringing all those people together and people being willing to be open and honest about who they are, addressing some bias, and being open to seeing things in a different light to allow opportunity for growth.
Rob, what about you? What, as you're hearing the conversation here, what flashed in your mind?
You know, the way that we've been talking about this recently is it's a good problem that we're in Buffalo, and that we've really gone through a renaissance as far as opportunities here. And of course, there's the national landscape of a talent shortage everywhere, right? In Buffalo, though, we had generations of having more job candidates than openings.
Right.
It is a flipped landscape now. So a lot of this is helping to educate the local employers on the best practices for engaging talent that still needs to be developed to an extent. And you're doing things like being intentional about who the first line supervisor is going to be, having training for that first line supervisor on what it means to mentor a new hire, having standard operating procedures for what that person is going to be expected to do so that the talent and the supervisor are on the same page. It really is about removing the false negatives on both sides, that this isn't going to be a good match for us. So I think what I am really excited about when we talk about this work, you see a lot of really motivated, passionate young professionals who, by engaging in this talent development and being intentional about it coming from diverse pipelines, they're developing a lot of leadership skills. They're going to be fantastic leaders for us in the next generation.
It's encouraging to hear that for sure. What about on the other side, though? What's stopping it? Because when you're talking about, okay, the first line supervisor, being intentional about who that person is, how they look, where they come from, that's interesting. But at the same time, not everybody's doing it, right? I mean, it sounds easy as we sit here and talk about it, but that's not what we see everywhere, right? Here in Western New York, or obviously across the country. But what about that? Who wants to maybe talk about what are the obstacles right now?
I mean, it's really, you have to find the people who are willing to do it. So what we do at Say Yes, we might be getting a yes from a CEO, but we need to get a yes from every level of leadership. So we need yes from hiring managers. We need yes from HR directors. It has to be.
You mean there's something going on in an organization that a CEO might not know?
No, I'm just, they get, you might have a leader saying, yes, this is absolutely great, but like we need all the human beings who are going to be involved in the decision making, who are going to be involved in hiring and working with our young people to all be on the same board, because it is it's a personal investment on your end to do things differently than how you've done it, and that's not easy for anyone, especially when we're having tough conversations around racial equity in our community, and practices that may need to change. Every company has invested tons of money, tons of time into policies and procedures to make sure their business operates, but have they been developed with an 18-year-old in mind? No. Most places no.
Right.
So that's going to really be a shift in culture, a shift in practices, and we recognize that's a lot of work for employers. So it really you have to identify the people who want to take that on, who wants to mentor an 18-year-old. And we say to our employers all the time, they're not just coming into the workforce fresh. They are transitioning into adulthood. That's such a huge time for learning. So it has to be the folks who really, want to embrace that in order to, bring in young talent, especially talent from underrepresented communities.
Well, I saw you nodding your head pretty profusely as Stephanie was talking. If you have something to add, please.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, right, for most organizations and companies and businesses, there is a bottom line, right? And it's very difficult to navigate all these other things that are happening when you have to meet deadlines, you have to produce, right? So you do need to have that, and I said organizational culture. You need that top-down organizational commitment to change. They need to understand that if we are able to turn the corner on this change, our organization will be better off. One of the obstacles, well, actually a couple obstacles, is number one, if you have people thinking that it's just charity. We're just doing this just because we need to help these folks out.
Right.
It won't work. It won't work. You have to believe that we need these people to do better things that we want to do in our organization. And the other issue is it's hard. It's hard. It's hard. And it takes me back to the book, and what I can appreciate about how Carol Anderson has set this up is she starts at Reconstruction, which honestly, if you want to study race relations in America, you got to take a look at Reconstruction, because the question we need to ask is, well, Civil War, North won, slavery should have been done. What happened? Didn't we go down into the South and eradicate plantations? Didn't we have black elected officials en masse? How did that turn into Jim Crow? Those are questions that have to be asked, right? So these are things that are baked into American culture, right? So if we want to do the hard work of deconstructing the ingredients to figure out how we got there, we're going to have to be committed to it. Right. And going back to what I said about businesses have a bottom line, when you have to measure and weigh bottom line and helping this person get into here, it becomes that challenge of, I got to do this. And it becomes easier to focus on the bottom line as opposed to focusing on changing the way we do business. And once again, if you don't believe that you're bringing people in a diverse capacity to do better in the business, why would you hang on to it?
Right.
So that's the difficulty in it. And Stephanie's completely correct, because you got to have that top-down agreement in an organization from CEO down to entry-level worker. Now, I ask this question: how many organizations do you know exist like that? It's a rhetorical question.
Thank you for not making me answer.
That was Stephanie Peete, Wil Green, and Rob Leteste in conversation with Jay Moran. And we close today's What's Next with a portion of the White Rage panel discussion presented by Say Yes Buffalo, and featuring Stephanie Peete and Rob Leteste as panelists, along with Akua Men's I Do, Hugh Russ, Anika Samuels, and Samuel Vaughn, with Wil Green moderating.
The title of the book, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. This book it takes you on a journey through history. The interesting thing is, in order to get to contemporary meaning and context, she talks about key points throughout history that have gotten us here. I think one of the most interesting points too, and I make this statement often, is like, if you erase slavery and you look at the history of African Americans in slavery and what happened after slavery, it's just as atrocious. It's just as atrocious. And she actually starts with Reconstruction. Being an educator, I understand the value of education, but I also understand the value of history. I don't think we get to a contemporary understanding without knowledge of what has happened previously, and we use that knowledge to forge a way forward. So what I like to do is I'll start with a quotation from the book, and then I'll open it up to our panelists just to share their ideas about that, okay? All right. And Stephanie said, this is a provocative title, White Rage, right? And of course, I think some people are gonna shy away from that. And I know when I think of rage, I think of something physical. I think of the Incredible Hulk tearing up a city, right? But what Carol Anderson is able to do is to disarm you a bit and not talk about the physical manifestation of white rage, but the insidious plots to perpetuate and enact white rage and get the results just through pen strokes. So there's no knocking over buildings, nothing like that. It is carefully coordinated and planned. All right, so first quotation, she talks about it. White rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its ways through the courts, the legislators, and a range of government bureaucracies.